All right, welcome to Module 3. We already went through basic kitchen safety and basic kitchen organization. Those are essential components of knowing how to cook. But now we're going to go into one of my favorite topics, something that I as a chef have been exploring for the last 13 years myself. In this module, we're going to talk about Flavor 101, flavor and the elements of good cooking. We're going to define what flavor is, what makes up flavor, and what are the basic elements of good cooking that you need to learn in order to become a better cook. A lot of what cooking is understanding what the reaction of a food is at that moment so that you can adjust as needed and have a very tasty end result. So before we get our hands dirty and before we get into the basic cooking techniques that you will apply into any recipe, it is important that you understand what flavor is and what the basic elements of good cooking are that bring out said flavor. This is one of the main topics that people have asked me to teach, and one of the main reasons why I created this course. As a chef myself, this has been one of the most difficult topics to learn and master over the last 13 years of my life. It takes time to learn and comprehend what foods work well with each other, but in due time, this becomes second nature. First, however, let's define flavor. What is flavor? Flavor is the marriage between taste, aroma, and sensory elements. Sensory elements being texture, temperature, appearance. When it comes to flavor, it is imperative one understands that the flavor receptors in the tongue taste the following 5 taste modalities: salt, sour, bitter, sweet, and umami or savory. So remember, flavor is taste, aroma, and sensory elements. We just went over the taste aspect of flavor, meaning how our body, our tongue, perceives all the tastes that come from the food. Let's look into aromas. Aromas are defined as the various chemical compounds that are found within food that are released during the cooking process. These compounds are what makes certain spices work well amongst one another. When cooking food, finding the balance between the 5 taste modalities, understanding the aromas, and understanding the sensory elements will yield a harmonious experience and a tasty dish. As you learn how to cook, learning which foods possess which taste profiles will help you create great flavor combinations. Ultimately, and in a very simplified explanation, the secret to good cooking comes from learning to balance those 5 taste modalities we just looked at to create a pleasant experience. Too much or too little of any of them may throw off the balance and create an unpleasant experience. So, with that being said, there are 4 basic elements of good cooking to learn to balance that will help enhance and create harmonious flavors in your food. These 4 elements are salt, fat, acid, and heat. Let's dive into each one of these and explain how these help build flavorful dishes. So I wanted to include the different basic flavor combinations along with the 4 basic elements of cooking, break that down for you and explain it very well so that you can apply and understand and comprehend this knowledge so that you can become a better cook and understand what your food is doing at the time of cooking. A recipe is a guideline. So really what I'm teaching you here is how to read that recipe, how to follow that guideline, and how to adjust it based on what you're seeing and experimenting. Let's get into it. Let's first look into salt. The primary role of salt in cooking is to amplify and enhance flavor. Learning how to use salt will be the best tool to bring out the natural flavor of your food. Salt has a greater impact on flavor than any other ingredient. Learning how to use it well is paramount to great cooking. That doesn't mean using more salt. On the contrary, it means learning to add the right amount at the right time in the right form. As well, salt minimizes bitterness, balances sweetness, and enhances aromas, all in all heightening the experience of eating. I highly encourage you to move away from using any kind of shaker and actually start using your hands to feel the salt and learn how much is enough and how much is not enough. Feeling the salt will give you a better understanding instead of throwing a wild guess into the ether by using a shaker. This is the process of learning how to cook, not simply just cooking. Anything that heightens flavor is seasoning. But generally speaking, this term, seasoning, refers to salt, since it's the most powerful flavor enhancer and modifier. Seasoning varies per culture and per dish. Keep that in mind. There is a range rather than a single point of proper seasoning. Certain cultures use more salt, like Argentinians in their meats, versus Japanese, who don't season their rice as they serve their rice with saltier foods. Hopefully this is making sense. I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but be ready because there's a lot more of this coming. So let's talk about the different salts that you can consider when buying them at the store. As you can see, there are many salts to consider when buying them at the store. Common table salt, or iodized salt, kosher salt, sea salt, or any other finishing salt like fleur de sel, maldon, or sal gris are all good options, and they all have their own purpose. As a chef, I highly encourage you to use kosher salt. Kosher salt is used in the koshering process, and that's where it gets its name from. It is coarser than regular table salt, and it has no additives, therefore it has a pure flavor. Because the flavor is pure, and because of the coarse grains, most professional kitchens use kosher salt. I use diamond crystal kosher salt at home for my day-to-day cooking, and I highly suggest that you adopt this for your day-to-day cooking too. Another great option is Morton kosher salt. It's gonna have a little different taste, but it's a good option. Table salt or iodized salt is very metallic. It's a very metallic flavor, it's very fine, and it typically leads to over-salting foods. I suggest not using regular table salt for your day-to-day cooking. Stick to kosher. Sea salts, on the other hand, are typically much coarser. The grains are larger, and they cover a larger surface of your tongue. They are used as finishing salts, meaning that they can be added right before serving a meat, a fish, a soup, or a salad. And because of their coarseness and their larger flakiness, it covers a larger surface of your tongue. It is also important to note that the layering of salts throughout your cooking process is very important. What does that mean? It means that seasoning your onions, the base of your onions as you're cooking a soup, is equally as important as seasoning a chicken before it is cooked for the same soup, and finishing the soup with a little extra maldon salt before it's served. Recipes will indicate different seasoning points throughout the process. Make sure you pay attention so that your food doesn't fall flat and is not flavorless. Lastly, as I mentioned before, always using your foods, whether it's using spices or salt, by making it rain. This concept was something I learned by brute force during one of my first internships as a sophomore in college. I was seasoning my food a little too close, and what was happening was that I was seasoning the food with patches. It wasn't even. This is something that I didn't even think about, and the food director at the time in the place where I was working came to me and pretty much chewed me. So what I mean by seasoning your food by making it rain is making sure that when you're seasoning it from high above. That means that you're seasoning your food from high above rather than seasoning your food very closely. If you have a fish that has some seasoning here and here, that is not seasoned properly, and the experience of eating it won't be good. Compared to if you're seasoning it from high above and all of the fish is evenly seasoned, then the entire protein will taste very good. This ensures proper seasoning, and this will save you a lot of time when seasoning your food. So remember, make it rain, don't just spit on it. Ultimately, whichever salts you decide to use, become familiar with them. Understand how they taste, how salty they are, how they feel, how they affect the flavor of your food, and how much you need to add. The best way to learn in this instance is to get your hands dirty and become one with the salt. I can't stress this enough. There's no right or wrong salt. I would say that kosher is the best for cooking, maldon the best for finishing. If you're afraid of oversalting, add a little bit at a time and taste your food. Always taste your food as you go. You can also take a spoonful of the dish that you are cooking and add some salt. If you get that zing, that like wow, then you know you have achieved the right seasoning for it. That's what I have to say about salt. I could go on and on and on. There's so much to cover within this topic alone. But this first basic element of good cooking is what will differentiate some really tasty food from some bland food. So make sure you review this point as much as you want and ultimately find the salt that works best for you and use my suggestions as your guidelines. Oh, and the last thing I want to tell you, I would highly suggest that you have a little container with a ceramic and or a plastic deli cup right next to your stove with your favorite cooking salt. In this case, I have kosher salt, and a finishing salt. In this case, I have Maldon. That way you can simply grab the salt from the side and season as you go. If you want to mix your salt and pepper, you can also do that. My suggestion for you is that you keep it to a 12:1 or 14:1 ratio, meaning 12 to 14 parts salt to 1 part pepper. That will look something like 12 grams of salt or 14 grams of salt to 1 gram of pepper. Keep that on the side, use it as you see fit, and of course adjust to your own needs and based on the salt that you're using. The second component of good cooking is fat. Speaking from a food composition perspective, fat is one of the 4 main components that make up food, along with protein, carbohydrate, and water. However, when it comes to cooking, fat can carry a variety of purposes. Let's look into 4 of those. First and foremost, fat is a conduit of heat, meaning it is a cooking medium and it helps food cook and transfer the energy from the heating unit to the pan and ultimately to the food for it to be cooked. Secondly, fat is flavor. Fat, whether in the format of an oil, butter, lard, avocado, nuts and seeds, even olives, adds a ton of flavor to food and helps season the food, also adding different textures. Fat also coats the mouth and allows for fat-soluble aromatics to be in longer touch with our taste buds, believe it or not. Third, fat is calorically dense. So from a nutritional perspective, it is an essential nutrient. Fat contains the most amount of calories per gram compared to carbs, protein, and alcohol. Fat contains 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories per gram for carbs and protein, and 7 calories per gram for alcohol. Because fat is an essential nutrient, it is grouped into the macronutrient or macro perspective. Macro meaning large or main. Fat provides a lot of nutritional value to the human body, including satiety, hormone balance, and in some instances, heart healthy benefits. It also helps absorb fat-soluble vitamins. Learning how to use fat and how fat works will determine texture as well. So this is the 4th point, which is super important in good cooking. Depending on how we use fats, we can achieve one of 5 distinct textures in food. That can be a crispy texture, creamy, flaky, tender, or a light texture. Meaning, if we decide to fry a food, we will achieve a crispy texture on the outside and soft on the inside. If we make a vinaigrette, for example, we create a creamy texture for the dish. We can also add butter to our dough to create flakiness and tenderness, believe it or not. And lastly, we can use milks and creams to create whipped creams or to transform a shot of espresso into a cappuccino. Kind of crazy, huh? So with that being said, here are a few pointers to always keep in mind when using fats. Because fat is a conduit to heat, using the right fats for the right cooking process is essential. When sauteing or heating a fat to a very high temperature, use a fat that has a high smoke point. A smoke point is the temperature at which an oil begins to smoke or it begins to burn. For cooking, I suggest always using an oil that has a high smoke point of about 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 205 degrees Celsius or above. As well, on the opposite hand, if you add some finishing oils, make sure you add them off heat and right before serving, as these have a lower smoke point and they don't necessarily do well with heat as they burn easily and produce free radicals and off flavors. But they add a great amount of flavor, texture, and mouthfeel to the final product. Finishing oils can add shine and luster to foods, making the visual experience that much more enjoyable. Because fat is a conduit of flavor as well, choosing the right fat for the right dish is essential. When cooking foods, certain olive oils, for example, can be excessively olivey, adding grassy notes that may not pair well with the rest of the dish. In this case, using a neutral tasting oil like avocado oil here to cook your food is my suggestion. These also tend to have a higher smoke point. Using coconut oil will add a coconutty flavor versus using an avocado oil which doesn't have any flavor whatsoever can actually make or break your dish. So make sure you're picking the right one for the right application. As well, using butter to finish a sauce and make it rich and creamy is another great way to not only use the right fat for the right purpose, but also to create a very pleasant experience. Lastly, from a nutritional standpoint, fat can also help the heart remain healthy, help the body reduce inflammation, and of course stay saturated for a longer period of time. Using anti-inflammatory oils and avoiding excessive use of seed oils can yield to an overall positive health. All in all, mixing oils for the right purpose is what I'm suggesting here. Make sure you pay attention to the temperatures and to what kind of oil a recipe is calling for. Using sesame or coconut oil, which are very flavorful oils, may not be the best case scenario for a dish that doesn't call for any of those flavor profiles. My favorite oil to cook is avocado oil, or if you find a brand of olive oil that is not extra virgin and has a very neutral taste, I would go with that. But again, for cooking, use oils that have a high smoke point. The third element of good cooking is acid. And acid is fascinating. It is one of the least understood components of good cooking, believe it or not. And in my humble opinion, one of the most important ones, aside from salt, of course. Acid is indispensable to everything we cook. It is like a conductor of an orchestra. The conductor makes sure that all of the notes and sounds play at the same time and come together in unison to form a beautifully tuned song. Scientifically speaking, acid is any food that has a pH level below 7. Acid by itself isn't particularly gratifying, but much like salt, acid heightens flavors within each dish and therefore heightens the pleasure in foods. Acid then is what brings all the flavors of a dish together. It is what rounds up all of the flavors and what brightens the essence of each dish. If salt enhances flavors, acid balances them and rounds them up. It can also act as a meat tenderizer and preserve foods by pickling. So the applications of this element varies widely in food. In this instance, we are only talking about acid's role in flavor. So let's look a little bit more into that. Examples of acids include citrusy lemon and lime, of course, and orange juice. Vinegars like apple cider, red wine vinegar, white wine vinegar, and various others vinegars like rice wines. Citrus zest, which is the peel of the lemons, can also act as acidic additives. Cultured dairy products like cheese, yogurt, buttermilk, creme fraiche, sour cream, and mascarpone also add acidic tones to food. Pickled and fermented foods also add pleasant acidic tones to the food. Pickled and fermented foods like pickled cucumbers, coffee and tea, tomatoes, canned tomatoes, or fresh tomatoes overall. And believe it or not, honey, molasses, dark caramel, beer, and sourdoughs, along with some breads, all include examples of acidic foods. Now, unlike the rest of the ingredients, acid is only needed in a small amount to do its job. The best way to use acid is by adding some to your dish and tasting it over and over again. When too much salt is added, the excess can be immediately tasted. With acid, if too much is added, you will taste sour notes. However, if the right amount is added, then the flavors will be bright, clean, and pleasantly balanced. Much like with salt, recipes will have different occasions when they call for acid to be added. Make sure you pay attention to that, because if you're adding some acid components to a recipe that has herbs too early, that will make the acid react with the herbs, browning the green of the herbs and not making it bright green. Just like how we learned with salt and layering the salt, sometimes at the beginning, sometimes in the middle, sometimes at the end, acid can also be layered. In some instances, the recipe will call for tomato product to be added during the initial part of the recipe, but at the end of it, it will call for some red wine vinegar to be added as well. This is just a random example, but what I'm getting at is that when you add acid to a recipe will affect the final flavor of the dish that you're trying to make. So make sure you're paying close attention, but also make sure that you're always adding acid to your recipe if it doesn't feel like it's got that rounded, bright flavor. And again, a little bit goes a long way. The fourth and final application of good cooking is heat. Now, I don't have a real example like I had for the first three on what heat is, but I can show you and explain in theory, so bear with me on this one. In essence, heat is a transfer of energy through or from one medium to another. In short, it is the element of transformation. Heat is what converts raw food into edible food, and for that matter, what creates flavor in food. So in this case, we're transferring energy from this element through the pan into the food. The application of controlled heat, and therefore learning how to do so, is what positively affects the finished product of food. Learning how to apply heat is an essential part of learning how to cook. To learn, one must engage all of one's senses, including common sense. Certain equipment will behave differently, so that common sense is going to come in handy. From baking to cooking savory foods, every recipe includes heating instructions within the general method of preparation. And the aim is always the same: to apply heat at the right level and at the right rate so that the surface of the food and its interior are done cooking at the same time. Because heat is flavorless and intangible, but its effects are quantifiable, when you apply heat while cooking, always pay attention to heat's sensory cues. What does that mean? That means the sizzle, the spatters, the crackles, the steams, the bubbles, aromas, the browning. All of that indicates how heat is reacting. Yes, if a recipe calls for a chicken to cook to 165 degrees Fahrenheit internally, a thermometer can tell you when it's gotten there. But has the outside cooked too quickly and burnt before the inside has reached that temperature? The way to properly learn how to apply heat is by focusing on the food when you're cooking. You can hear all of your sensory cues, just as I mentioned, but you should also taste your food constantly. You should feel it, you should see it, and you should understand how the food is reacting to the heat that you're applying. See how the food is reacting to the heat. That's how you can adjust, and that's how you can get to a beautiful final product. This is what good cooking is all about. Much of cooking is comprehending how the food is reacting during the cooking process, all while having your final product in mind. What does that mean? Let me give you an example. Let's continue with the chicken example that I just mentioned. We want a golden brown crispy crust on the chicken, but we also want the interior to be fully cooked out of safety. So now that you know what you're after, what the final product is, you can reverse engineer that process. If I want a crispy chicken, I need to get a pan hot, add some fat so that the fat can help sear the exterior of the chicken. If I want the chicken not to dry, then I need to make sure I adjust the heat after my fat is hot in the pan and after I add the chicken to the pan. If I want the chicken to be tasty before searing, I need to season it with salt and pepper and any other spices that I may want. And if I want to simply use heat to create a chemical reaction for the sear, then I need to get my oven ready so I can finish cooking the chicken in the oven after I sear it. What I have just described is a recipe, a back-engineered process to achieve the desired final product. So when you read a recipe, understand what the final desired goal of the process is. Think of a recipe's temperatures and cooking times as suggestions rather than fixed rules. And pay attention to how your food is cooking and adjust the heat as needed. As you experiment with different foods, you will learn how they generally react with heat. With heat, I also want to touch on two important points. Gentle heat. When you're cooking food at a gentle heat, the goal is always the same: to achieve tenderness, maintain the moisture and delicate texture, think of eggs, fish, shellfish, and also transform any dry and tough ingredients into a moist and tender final result. Think short ribs or chuck. On the other hand, intense heat is used to brown the surfaces of food while keeping the moist juice interior intact. Think searing a flank steak to a beautiful medium rare doneness, or a chicken so that you can brown the outside and then finish it in the oven. There are a variety of cooking methods that fall under gentle heat and intense heat. We will look at those in the next module. That's when all of this is going to make sense and we're going to get our hands dirty and learn how to apply all these things. A few closing statements to finish this module. When it comes to creating good, flavorful combinations, the key is to experiment and find combinations that you enjoy. Here are a few tips to help you create delicious and satisfying meals. Consider complementary flavors. Some flavors go well together because they enhance and balance each other. For example, sweet and sour flavors can complement each other, as can salty and savory flavors. Experiment with different flavors to see which ones you like best. Mix and match ingredients. Another way to create good flavor combinations is to mix and match different ingredients. For example, you could try combining sweet fruits with savory herbs, or mixing spicy chili peppers with creamy avocado. Experiment with herbs and spices. Herbs and spices are a great way to add flavors to your meals without adding any calories or sodium. Try using different herbs and spices to add depth and complexity to your dishes. For example, you could try adding some oregano to a tomato sauce or some cumin to a bean salad. Basil could be great also for the tomato sauce. Use your senses. When you're creating flavor combinations, it's important to use your senses to guide you. Taste your food as you cook and make adjustments as needed. And don't be afraid to experiment and try new things. You never know what delicious flavor combinations you might discover. When it comes to flavor combination, that can be a course on and of itself. I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole, but I want to recommend two books that have been a great resource to me: The Flavor Bible and The Science of Spice. The Science of Spice is a fairly recent and new book that has helped me understand how to combine different spices. Check out the resource section with links to these books so that you can get them at home. Be patient with this. It's going to take some time to understand different flavor combinations, but with the support of people that understand the science and have put it into textbooks, I am confident that you will be able to create delicious food. And that's the end of Module 3. I know I just gave you a lot of food for thought, pun intended. Make sure you remember that when it comes to flavor, balancing the 5 taste modalities and applying the 4 basic techniques of good cooking will yield to good flavor. In the next module, we're going to put theory into practice and apply all the knowledge that we gained in this module into cooking. When I was in culinary school, it was very difficult to understand the basic flavors of cooking, the basic process of cooking, because it was given to me in a very theoretical way and also in a very practical way, but I had to put all those concepts together. The intention with this module was for you to understand it and for me to be very obvious on how you can make very tasty food. So I hope that that's what you found and that's what you learned here. I'll see you in the next module.